The kingdom sent its finest women to guide her. She chose the one nobody would even look at. The stone was coldest in the last hour before dawn, when the kitchen fires had gone low overnight and nothing had yet been stoked back to warmth. Sarah Voss knew this the way she knew most things. Through her palm, pressed flat against the outer kitchen wall, finger spread, counting to 5. 2 degrees colder than yesterday. The northern wind had swung east in the night. She adjusted the weight of her shawl before she turned around, folded the front edge up and tucked it tighter across her collarbone, and went back inside before the head cook arrived to find her standing outside doing nothing. She was never standing outside doing nothing, but explaining that would require a conversation, and conversations had a way of becoming negotiations, and negotiations had a way of reminding people that Sarah had no standing to negotiate from. Better to simply be inside when the head cook arrived. The palace kitchen ran on a particular rhythm that Sarah had learned the way she learned every room, not by being told, but by being still long enough to feel it breathe. There was a boy named Pell who always knocked the copper pot off the second shelf when reaching for the ladle above it, not because he was clumsy but because he closed his eyes when he reached and misjudged the angle. Sarah had stopped that pot from falling 7 times in 3 months without Pell ever noticing. She simply placed herself in the right position before he reached. There was a woman named Koss who cried silently over the bread troughs every morning between the second and third bell, some private grief she carried into the palace from wherever she went at night, and Sarah never acknowledged it and never told anyone and always made sure to be the one who carried the heavy flour sacks on those mornings so that Koss had fewer movements to manage while her hands were doing their remembering. None of this was assigned. None of it was noted. Sarah did not do it to be noticed. The lie she carried, pressed into her as permanently as the Thornwall pack brand had been pressed out of her, was this: the kindest thing she could do for anyone who mattered was to stay small enough that they never had to choose between her and something they needed. She had learned this in a pack circle at noon, at age 12, from the woman who had named her. She had been learning it every day since. She was 23 now, and she was very good at being small. By the time the first bell rang and the kitchen filled with bodies and noise and the particular warm smell of rendered fat and yeast, Sarah had already begun 3 fires, sorted the morning's grain delivery by quality without being asked, and identified, from the changed angle of the bread-proofing cloth, that the overnight temperature had dropped enough to slow the rise and that the morning loaves would need an extra quarter hour. She mentioned this to no one. She simply adjusted the placement of the proofing trays herself and went back to her station. She had been at Falcone Palace for 6 months. She had been assigned to kitchen work because there was nowhere lower to assign a wolfless omega who had been vouched for by a bedridden woman in the North Wing servant rooms, a woman named Maren Voss, who shared Sarah's last name and who had requested her placement through a letter written in a careful, deliberate hand that bore the faint impression of long practice. Sarah had not seen Maren in 11 years. She had arrived at the palace gate with Maren's letter, and the understanding that Maren's reasons were her own and that asking about them was not the same as surviving. She had survived. She had made herself useful, which was the only form of safety she knew. And every morning, before the others arrived, she took a route through the palace that was 3 minutes longer than it needed to be, past the eastern corridor, past the base of the tower stairs, past the carved stone arch that separated the servant passages from the formal hall. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because her body mapped routes the way it mapped everything, quietly, in advance, against a need she could not yet name. The East Tower was where Princess Lyra Falcone lived. Sarah had never been inside it. She had no reason to go inside it. She just knew, the way the stone wall knew the temperature of the night, that the route existed and that she had walked it enough times to walk it in the dark. She was on her 3rd morning pass of that route, carrying a tray of bread to the formal dining hall, which required her to go almost nowhere near the East Tower but which she had taken a particular interest in personally delivering, when she heard the door. Not a door opening. A door slamming open. The difference in the sound is the difference between departure and escape. A Dora crane came out of the East Tower door the way water comes out of a burst pipe, under pressure, moving fast, directed by nothing but the urgency of release. She was one of the high-born she-wolves of the Ashford house, broad-shouldered and silver-eyed and wearing the formal blue sash of a royal guide, and her left hand was wrapped in linen that had already bloomed red at the palm. She did not look at Sarah. She looked through her. "That girl," she said to the empty corridor, to no one, to everyone, to the stone itself, "is a curse." She walked past. Her boots were loud on the floor. She did not look back. The east tower door had swung to its full extension and was standing open. Not ajar. Open. As if whatever had been keeping it controlled had simply let go. Sarah stood in the corridor with her bread tray and looked at the open door for a long moment. She thought about the route she had been walking for 3 months for no reason she could name. She thought about the cold of the stone wall at dawn. She thought about the way her body prepared for things before her mind caught up. Then she shifted the bread tray to her left hand and walked toward the open door. And if you found yourself leaning forward already, unable to stop, quietly hit subscribe before we go further. You won't regret it. The steward of internal affairs was a man named Ozias Pemberton, first name from a records ledger, last name from whichever house had last done him a favor, and he used the word temporary 3 times in a single sentence when he assigned Sarah to Princess Lyra's guidance, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about how permanent it was. "You will serve as temporary guide, temporarily, until a temporary replacement of appropriate standing is located," he said, and wrote it down as he said it so that the writing was also temporary, she supposed. He said it in the main corridor outside the kitchens, in a loud enough voice that 3 passing servants heard it, which was not an accident. Ozias Pemberton never said anything loudly by accident. He was establishing, for the record, that this was a temporary measure beneath his preferences and outside his recommendations. "Of course," Sarah said. She had the bread tray in her hands. She had not yet put it down. What happened next was not something Ozias Pemberton had prepared for. Cressida Theron appeared in the corridor the way a cold front appears. You became aware of it before you could identify the moment it arrived. She was 61 years old and built like a woman who had never wasted a movement in her life. Economical, precise, dressed in the grey and gold of the High Council with her silver hair pinned back so severely that the act of pinning it seemed like a form of argument. She was the first voice of the Compact of the 7 Houses, and she had been High Councillor for 14 years, which was longer than Ronan Falcone had held a veto he had never used to contradict her. "I was informed of the reassignment," she said, and she did not need to raise her voice because the corridor had the peculiar architectural quality of amplifying her naturally. "I want it understood for the record that assigning a wolfless domestic to the guidance of the royal princess is an insult to the crown's dignity and a direct violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of Article 9 of the Compact." Ozias Pemberton made a sound that was trying to be an explanation and not succeeding. Cressida did not look at Ozias Pemberton. She looked at Sarah. It was the particular kind of look that takes a complete inventory without lingering, the kind that prices things. "The spirit of the law," Cressida said, "to the air, to the stone, to the principle of the thing, is more than sufficient here." The east tower door was still open. From inside it, from the top of the stairs, from somewhere in the middle distance of stone and shadow, came a voice. "I can hear you," Lyra Falcone said. The voice was 15 years old and clear as cold water, and it carried down the stone stairs without effort or strain. It was not a princess's declaration. It was a statement of fact made by someone who wanted the people speaking to know that they had been heard, and who was making no larger claim than that. "I know what she smells like," Lyra continued, and her voice was already closer. She had started down the stairs while speaking. "The other ones smelled like ambition and wolf musk and a soap that cost more than their salary. She smells like cold stone and plain soap, and she knocked on my door yesterday to tell me the bread tray was outside it, which no one else has done in 3 months, and I will walk with her or I will not walk at all." She appeared at the bottom of the tower stairs with her crown slightly askew and her cane touching the 3rd step before the last and her blindfold perfectly straight, and she stopped with the precision of someone who had counted every stair and knew exactly where the floor began. Cressida Theron's expression did not change. This was its own kind of change. "I will be filing a formal petition," she said, and the smile she produced then was the smile of someone who had wanted the situation to escalate and found it obliging, with the full council at tomorrow's session. She turned and walked away. Her boots, unlike Adora Crane's, made no sound at all. Sarah shifted the bread tray back to her right hand. She looked at Lyra, at the slightly askew crown, at the chin that was lifted with the particular angle of someone orienting by sound. She crossed the corridor to the tower door and climbed the 3 steps to the landing and offered her free hand at the height where Lyra's hand already was, open, waiting. Lyra's grip, when it closed around her wrist, was not the grip of someone being steadied. It was the grip of someone who had been waiting for the right thing to hold onto and had found it and was not letting go. Sarah carried the bread tray in her left hand and guided the princess with her right and did not say anything about what had just happened in the corridor, and neither did Lyra, and between them the silence was the kind that is building towards something rather than away from it. They developed a language in the first week that neither of them had invented consciously. It happened the way language always happens, out of necessity, refined by repetition, until what had been effort became instinct. A pressure from the left meant doorway on the right. 2 quick touches to the wrist meant 3 steps down. A single held touch, steady, unmoving, meant stop, something has changed, wait. Lyra learned the signals faster than Sarah gave her credit for, which made Sarah extend them. More nuance, more variation, because Lyra was processing every signal and feeding back her own. A small tightening of her fingers when she wanted to turn, a relaxing of her wrist when she was confident. By the end of the 2nd week they had a conversation going through their hands that was more specific than anything Sarah had managed to say aloud in 6 months. Ronan Falcone saw them for the first time on the 9th day, from across the south courtyard. He was in consultation with his guard captain, Ferris, about the scheduling of the Eastern Patrol changes. He was looking at a map. He was not looking at the courtyard. And then a noble's hunting dog, a large grey thing that had slipped its handler at the courtyard gate, came around the eastern wall at a sprint and targeted the moving shape of a small figure in green velvet with the single-minded enthusiasm of a dog that had misidentified a game animal. Ronan moved before Ferris did, before the 2 posted guards registered what was happening. He stepped into the dog's path with enough mass to redirect it sideways, caught its collar one-handed, and held it while it scrambled and barked and found no purchase on his grip. He passed it to Ferris without looking at him. "Remove it from the palace grounds," he said. "Animals without dedicated handlers are a liability in public spaces." He did not look at Lyra. He did not look at Sarah, who had pulled Lyra behind her body in one smooth motion and was still standing in that position, between the princess and the space where the dog had been, with her empty hand held slightly out to her side, fingers spread, a gesture of measurement. He walked back to the map. Ferris, who had been his guard captain for 12 years and who was therefore professionally obligated not to have opinions about most things, said nothing. He simply noted, privately, that the king had not been watching the dog. He had been watching the courtyard for some time before the dog appeared. It was 18 days after the assignment that Ronan was on the upper gallery at the 3rd bell of pre-dawn and could not sleep. He had not been sleeping well for some time. He did not examine why. He walked the gallery because it was the farthest he could go from his chambers without entering the formal spaces of the palace, and because the gallery was open to the outside air at the far end, and at this hour the cold came in honest and clean off the northern hills. He was not looking down into the lower corridor. He was looking at the hills. Then he was not looking at the hills. She was below him in the interior passage, the one that ran along the base of the outer wall before the kitchen entrance. She was standing facing the wall, not leaning against it, standing upright, very still, with her right palm flat against the stone at shoulder height, fingers spread. Her eyes were open. She was not looking at the wall. She was reading it. He had seen a thing like this once, a tracker from the Southern Territories who could determine from the temperature of bark how many days ago a fire had burned nearby. Sarah stood at the wall for the count of 5. He counted with her, silently, from the gallery. Then she withdrew her hand, and adjusted the shawl around her collarbone, and walked toward the kitchen without looking behind her. Ronan stood at the gallery railing for some time after she left. He was not watching the kitchen door. He was looking at the place where she had stood. He went back to bed. He did not sleep any better, but the quality of the wakefulness had changed into something he declined to examine. The misunderstanding happened on the 22nd day, in the late afternoon, when the council session had been running for 3 hours and the voices from the eastern chamber were carrying through the corridor walls in that particular way that meant the disagreement had become personal. Sarah had learned the acoustic shape of this palace the way she learned all spaces, completely and without intending to. She knew that the eastern chamber's argument frequency traveled down the corridor toward the main hall, and she knew that Lyra's jaw did a particular thing when she registered a certain range of sustained angry voices, tightened at the hinge, slightly, not visible unless you were paying attention from the right angle, and she knew that Lyra had not had a midday meal because the kitchen had sent the wrong tray and Sarah had not been there to redirect it. So when they reached the branch in the corridor that went left toward the eastern wing and right toward the garden passage, Sarah gave the light 2-tap signal on Lyra's wrist and guided them right. She did not know Ronan was in the alcove at the corridor junction until she was past it and Lyra's fingers told her, the faint tightening that meant someone else was present, someone who sent Lyra recognized before Sarah registered the sound. She did not turn around. She continued down the garden passage. In the alcove, Ronan watched them turn away from his council chamber. He had been emerging from the council session to take air, unusual, documented nowhere, noticed by no one. He had seen Sarah redirect Lyra away from the eastern wing. The story he told himself about what he had seen was this: the wolfless servant was making decisions about where the princess could and could not go. She was inserting herself between the royal bloodline and its father. She was exceeding her assignment. This was the story he told himself. It was entirely wrong. He did not know it was wrong. The reader does. He issued the reassignment order through Osiers Pemberton the following morning. Sarah was to be transferred to laundry assignment. A proper guide would be sourced within the week. Lyra did not speak at breakfast. She did not come out of her room for the midday meal. She did not come out for the evening meal either. On the second day, when a servant brought her tray to the door and knocked, she said, from inside, "Tell the king that his daughter is well, and that she is simply choosing not to walk anywhere until she has someone worth walking with." On the third day, Ronan reversed the order. He communicated through Osiers Pemberton that operational considerations regarding the princess's established navigational routines made a reassignment inadvisable at this time. Osiers Pemberton wrote it down in his careful hand and sent a copy to the council log. Cressida Theron read the council log the same afternoon. She held it for a long moment, then placed it back on the stack. Her expression did not change. She picked up a different document. It was the Article 9 petition, already drafted, already signed by herself and 4 of the 7 House representatives. She had been waiting for the right moment to file it. She thought, reading Osiers Pemberton's careful language about operational considerations, that the right moment had arrived. Before that moment came, and if this story is making you feel things you didn't expect to feel, you should know that someone out there hit subscribe and somehow, somewhere, a child got a meal today. Just saying. Sarah had discovered the truth about Adora Crane's departure not by investigating but by being still and listening, which was the same method she used for everything. She had been in the linen storage room when 2 senior attendants passed the door with their voices slightly lower than they thought they needed to be. The name they used was Cressida Theron's. The sum they mentioned was significant. The phrase they used was released from service. Adora Crane had not quit. She had been purchased. Sarah replayed the previous 3 months through this new lens. The guide before Adora, a woman named Helois Vance, who had lasted 9 days and then requested a transfer to a different house, had also been highborn, also wolf-blooded, also eminently qualified, and had also left under circumstances that were described as personal preference. Before Helois, another. Before her, another. Cressida had been clearing the field for months. Not to harm Lyra. To control her. If Lyra had no acceptable guide, the princess could be managed through her isolation, steered, through helplessness, into whatever arrangement best served the compact's interests. Sarah stood in the linen storage room with this understanding and felt something move in her chest that she had no language for, not anger, which she had learned not to give room because anger took up space, and she had spent 11 years not taking up space. Something older than anger. something that knew the shape of what had been done to the princess because it recognized its own history. She folded the linen she had been sent to retrieve and carried it back to its destination and said nothing to anyone, and the knowledge went into the same place she kept all the knowledge that she gathered without being asked. Somewhere it would be available when it was needed. The petition came on a Tuesday. Cressida Theron stood before the full council, 8 members present, Ronan at the head, and read Article 9 of the Compact of the 7 Houses aloud in its entirety. Her voice was level throughout. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The law said what the law said. She had 5 signatures beside her own. She needed only 4 for a binding council vote. The vote was 5-2. Ronan said, "The compact is law." He said it the way he said everything, without visible cost, in the tone of a man who had made his peace with all his principles before he ever took a seat at a council table. His 2 dissenting councillors said their piece and were noted for the record. The vote stood. Ozias Pemberton was dispatched to find Sarah. She was in the East Tower when he found her, not in Lyra's room, but in the corridor outside it, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and Lyra's hand holding hers through the gap at the door's base. The door was not open, but the gap at the floor was wide enough for a hand, and Lyra's hand was through it, and Sarah's hand was around it, and they had been sitting like that for some time without speaking. Ozias Pemberton told her she had 1 hour. He did not look at the joined hands. He looked at the wall. Sarah gave Lyra's fingers one long, steady press, the signal they had made for stop, something has changed, wait, and then withdrew her hand and stood up. She had almost nothing to collect. This was not poverty. This was the accumulated practice of 11 years of traveling light, of keeping herself in a state of permanent portability, because people who have been declared disposable learn early that rooms are borrowed, not owned. She had a change of clothes. She had a small knife that was older than her time at the palace. She had a piece of obsidian, smooth and flat, that she had carried since the winter in the woodcutter's linter because it held cold exceptionally well and she had used it to sleep-cool her fever that winter, and she had kept it since then for reasons she did not examine. She had rolled her sleeping mat halfway when she felt the resistance in the lining. Not the resistance of padding. The resistance of something folded inside padding. Flat, square, papery. She unrolled the mat fully. She found the seam, careful handwork, not palace issue, sewn by someone who knew how to hide something so it would only be found by someone looking carefully. She opened it. The letter inside was on paper so old it had gone the color of cream at the edges. The handwriting was the careful, deliberate hand of someone writing something they wanted to last. It was not addressed to a position or a title. It was addressed to whoever loves her silences. Sarah sat down on the rolled mat and read it. The letter was from Alara Falcone, the dead queen. Written, the date made Sarah count twice, 11 years ago, before Lyra's birth was complete, in the hours before the dawn that did not come right for her. She had written it to a future person she could not name, the one who would understand her daughter not by what Lyra could not do but by what she already was. The one who would not try to see for her, but would move with her instead. The one who would learn her silences. At the bottom of the letter, beneath Alara's signature, was a second line. Different ink. Different hand. Older, less steady, but shaped by the same care. She is coming. I have arranged it. Keep this letter until she finds it. The second signature was Marin Voss. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. She had arrived at this palace with a letter from a woman who shared her last name and who had requested her specifically and who had given no reason. She had been given a sleeping mat in a room that had been empty. The mat had been prepared before she arrived. Marin, bedridden, north wing, stipend, human, quiet, had placed this letter in the lining of this mat and had sent for Sarah before any of the events that followed had happened, which meant that Marin had known, or had believed with enough certainty to act on it, that Sarah would end up in this room, in this role, at this moment. The obsidian in Sarah's hand had gone warm from her grip. She put the letter in her apron pocket. She picked up her things. She went down the servants' stairs and through the side passage and out into the east courtyard, which was the route out of the palace grounds. She stopped. In the center of the main courtyard, where the afternoon light came in long and low and turned the grey stone briefly amber, Lyra Falcone was standing. Alone. Crown slightly askew, as it always was. Cane touching the ground in front of her, not sweeping but resting. She didn't need to sweep, she had memorized this floor long ago. Her blindfold perfectly straight. Her shoulders back. Her chin lifted at the angle Sarah knew meant she was listening to the courtyard breathe, identifying positions by the echo returns off the walls, reading the space through its sound. She had walked 3 unguided corridors to be here. 3 corridors that every attendant in the palace would have told you were impossible for her to navigate alone, because no one had ever bothered to ask her how much of the palace she had memorized simply by living in it. She was not lost. She was not asking for help. She was making herself visible. She was standing in the center of a courtyard that every window in the palace looked down into, and she was standing there with her crown on and her cane in hand and nothing else, and it was the most articulate statement Sarah had ever seen anyone make without words. Sarah stood at the edge of the courtyard with her bundled belongings and looked at Lyra for a long moment. She did not move. She could not have explained why. She simply could not make her feet continue in the direction they had been going. The council session that Ronan called was recorded in the palace archives as emergency session number 47 of the 22nd year of his reign. The note beside it in the record reads, duration, 12 minutes. Outcome, see attached. The attached document is 2 pages long and concerns the compact of the 7 houses and what remains of it. He sent for the document himself. He did not send a clerk. He went to the council vault in person, unlocked it with the key he carried on a chain at his hip, and emerged with the parchment rolled under his arm. The guards at the vault entrance noted his expression. None of them recorded what they thought it was. He entered the council chamber and laid the parchment on the table. The council members present were 6 of the 8, Cressida among them, in her grey and gold, already very still in her seat in the particular way of someone who has anticipated the weather. Ronan did not sit. He stood at the head of the table. He said, I have been informed of the circumstances surrounding the guidance appointments over the past 8 months. The paid releases. The sequenced departures. Cressida said, the compact's Article 9 remained the basis of. I know what the basis was, he said. He picked up the compact. He had held this document before, at his accession, when he had sworn to it, at each session opening, when the clerk of records checked the seal, at the signing of sub-treaties that referenced it. He knew its weight. He knew its texture, the slight grain of the parchment, the edges that had gone just slightly soft with age, the 7 wax seals of the 7 houses pressed into its face like a family of closed eyes. He tore it in half. The sound it made was unremarkable. Paper tearing always sounds smaller than the thing it represents. He placed both halves on the table. He did not look at anyone. Cressida reached into the document portfolio beside her chair and produced a second page. Her hand was perfectly steady. Co-regency petition, she said, signed by 3 of the 7 houses, contingent on the compact's remaining integrity. Filed yesterday, awaiting validation. Per subclause 7 of the compact itself. She paused, and for the first time something moved in her expression that was not calculation, something that looked, briefly, like the face of a woman watching a bridge burn that she had been certain would hold. Per subclause 7, this petition is void without the compact. She looked at Ronan. You've just destroyed your own removal, she said. He looked at the 2 halves of the parchment on the table. He had not known about the petition. That was visible in the single moment between her words and his response. Not shock, but the particular recalibration of someone who has leapt and discovered mid-air that the landing is not what they thought, and who is going to land anyway. Then we both lost something today, he said. He left the chamber. He walked through the great hall and the connecting passage and out through the main entrance to the courtyard. He walked at his ordinary pace, which was not hurried and was not unhurried. It was the pace of a man who had made a decision and was walking toward its consequences. Lyra was still in the courtyard. Sarah was at its edge. He did not go to Lyra first. He did not go to Sarah. He walked to the outer wall of the courtyard, the north face, the coldest face, the one that never caught afternoon light, and he raised his right hand and pressed his palm flat against the stone. He counted. Sarah saw it happen from 30 feet away. She saw his fingers spread against the stone the way hers did every morning, the way she had been doing for 11 years, the private habit she had never shown anyone and never explained to anyone. She saw him count. She could tell by the slight change in his breathing, to 5. He withdrew his hand. He turned and looked at her across the courtyard. He said nothing. She understood what it meant. She understood it the way you understand a language you were told you would never be allowed to learn, completely, immediately, with a recognition that went all the way down. She did not say it back to him. She turned instead to Lyra, who was still standing in the center of the courtyard with her crown on and her cane resting, listening to everything. "Are you staying?" Lyra said. "Not are you allowed to stay. Not are you permitted to stay, or will they let you stay, or is it safe to stay? Are you staying?" The question in the voice of someone who had already decided that the question was Sarah's to answer and no one else's. Sarah looked at the courtyard, at the stone flags and the amber light and the crown slightly askew and the cane and the hand that was reaching sideways, open, not grasping, just present and waiting. She had spent 11 years making herself small enough not to be chosen. She had spent 11 years answering that kind of question with "if you need me," or with silence, or with the deflection of someone who had been taught that wanting something for herself was the first step toward losing it. She looked at Lyra's open hand. She said, "I want to stay. Not if you need me. Not if it helps. Not if it's useful or permitted or within the scope of her assignment. I want to." The words were ordinary. The sound they made coming out of her own mouth was nothing she had a precedent for, not relief, not arrival, but something more exact and more irreversible. The sound of a door that has been sealed for 11 years opening not because someone forced it but because she had finally, simply, turned the handle herself. She walked to Lyra and took her hand, and the pressure she used was no signal from their language. It was just her hand, holding on. Behind her, across the courtyard, a king who had just given 6 alliances to the eastern wind stood with his back to the north-facing wall and did not speak. He had said everything he was going to say with his palm against the stone. Lyra's fingers tightened around Sarah's wrist. Not the grip of someone who needed to be steadied. The grip of someone who had been waiting for the right thing to hold on to. Sarah adjusted the weight of her bundled belongings against her hip, and felt the corner of the letter in her apron pocket press against her palm, and thought of Marin Voss in the North Wing room, 11 years of waiting, a letter in a sleeping mat, a question arranged before it was asked. She had a great many things to say to Marin Voss. She would say them tomorrow. Tonight, she stood in a courtyard with amber light going grey and a princess's hand around her wrist and the knowledge, new, untested, slightly frightening in the way only real things are frightening, that she was not staying because it was useful. She was staying because she wanted to. That was hers. It had always been hers. She had simply never let herself take it until now. E.N.D. A note for those who made it here. Stories like this one exist because you keep coming back to them. If this reached you somewhere real today, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and know that your presence here is what keeps this going.